To why we started this series. As you know, the last few years there's been a couple of incidents in our nation. One very positive in the election of Barack Obama, the other very negative in the tragic death of Trayvon Martin. Both of these events that have taken place in our society have caused the issue of race to come back to the fore in various ways. There's been a lot of dialogue around the country surrounding the president's election, and then that became magnified during the time period of the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial. And when that took place, a group of folks, myself, Bryson White, and Phil Sky from the Unitarian Fellowship, we decided to come together to talk about what would it look like to begin to have conversations about race here in our city. How can we begin to bridge the gaps that exist racially in our city, and how can we begin to address these divides? And so we started to talk about putting together the Race in Fresno series. And the first series that we did was around bringing pastors together to talk about how that issue exists within the church, and we did that at the West Side Church of God. The second series that we did focused on interpersonal racism, how that exists between relationships. And this third portion of our series is on how race functions within systems, specifically how race functions within the prison industrial complex. And so those two events, though, just a backdrop, gave rise to us to begin to have a dialogue as a city, a dialogue with civility, a dialogue with honesty, to talk about how this issue functions in our beloved city. And so just again, I want to thank each and every one of you for sacrificing your time to come out to participate in an honest dialogue around race in our city, because we know it's a difficult subject to talk about, right? So we look forward to hearing your responses and going forward, not only this night, but going forward as a city. So I want to welcome Pastor Phil Sky up to further our introduction. If you can welcome him with a round of applause, that would be awesome.
Thank you, Bryson. Before we go much further, how many of you, this is the first time you've been in this theater since it's been renovated? Isn't this a gorgeous place? Absolutely. I mean, it's just beautiful. And I want to say, you know, what a privilege it is to have Fresno City College as a partner in the organization, along with Faith and Community and Unitarian Fellowship, for this third conversation. As you know, Fresno City College is one of the most important educational and vocational assets we have in our city. Is that right? Absolutely. So it's a great privilege to be here. So many thanks to Carla Kirk and Fresno City College for joining us for this third conversation. I want to say Bryson did a great job of giving you a bit of a background and history of where these conversations have come from. And so here we are hosting this third conversation. We've really moved from a conversation that was initially hosted with clergy, particularly senior pastors, at that first conversation at Westside Church of God. We want to talk about how the church engages race in our society. Then we broadened the conversation a bit as we moved over to the First Chinese Baptist Church. We broadened it by inviting community members at large to sit on the panel and to, again, speak to this issue, but more from an interpersonal perspective. How is race or racism played out through our relationships with one another? Tonight, we push the conversation further. We move beyond our own identities. We move beyond race and racism in interpersonal relationships, and we press it into systems and structures. Because race is informing all three of those areas of our lives every day of our lives. But the one that we're least familiar with, the one that affects us perhaps more every day, and yet it's the one that we identify the least, is the way in which race is couched within our systems and structures. So tonight, we sort of lean on some of the work of Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow by just bringing forward to you tonight a dialogue about race and the prison system. I want to say this about tonight, and I think our moderator will speak to this just a bit more, but this conversation Obviously, tonight we want to have a safe dialogue, but we also want a very truthful and honest dialogue. I want to acknowledge that tonight, as we have this conversation, that many of you in the audience will absolutely disagree with what some people on the panel might say, and you may disagree with what some people in the audience will share later during a time of questions and answers. I want you to know, on behalf of Fresno City College, No Name Fellowship, and Faith and Community, that that is okay. You can disagree, and that's totally appropriate. But we're going to disagree with respect, and because we realize that our disagreements come from personal experience in many cases, come from books we've read, come from theories that we have. But that's what makes a dialogue rich, is multiple perspectives being shared and seeking ultimately a greater understanding that we will walk out with together tonight. So I wanted to say that. As we turn now to sort of the evening, I want to point out a few logistical items. First of all, the bathrooms. So it is everyone's it's probably the most popular question, is where in the world do I use the restroom? So it's not easy to find, actually. So you cannot go just out the doors here because they're not out there. That's where I would put them, but they're not there. So what you need to do is, men, you exit these doors, and then you turn right, so my right, your left, down the breezeway, and the door will be on your left-hand side. Women, not next to men, because they don't trust us together, okay? And so you're going to actually head down here. You'll take a left at the breezeway, head on down, and your restroom is on the right-hand side. Okay, so men on the right, exit out. Women on the left, exit out to your left, and you'll find the restrooms as you need them. I also want to say this before I sit down. Tonight there is a period of time toward the end, you'll notice it here on your program for the evening, where you have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. And so in your, actually I think it was handed to you as you walked in, was an index card. Does everyone have one of these? It's just a 3x5 index card. So shake your head side to side or say something, I don't have it. Okay, all right, we're going to pass them out along the way. In the meantime, you can use this blank piece of paper to jot down some thoughts in the interim. And you'll write down your questions. Now, there are a lot of people here tonight, and we cannot honestly answer all of your questions this evening. So, having said that, you're going to take your questions at any point throughout the evening to the back of the room where the video camera is set up. Andrew Fowle, raise your hand. Andrew is right up here. He'll be back there. Bryson White is back there. You can hand your question at any point throughout the evening to them. We will also be coming by at different points as well, collecting them from you. We will then be sifting through them, and in the interest of choosing as broad a range of questions as we can, we will be pre-selecting questions, and then we'll take it from there later on this evening during that portion of our program. All right? I think that's it. I want to just simply say a great big thank you to our moderator tonight, Reverend Sofia Betancourt. Reverend Sofia is the interim minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church right here in Fresno. We're so grateful for her being here and moderating tonight. She is an incredible leader in this city. She is an incredible leader within her denomination, where she is the director of racial and ethnic concerns within her denomination. She also is pursuing right now a PhD at Yale in religious ethics and African American studies, actually a dual PhD. So she is very qualified tonight to lead us, and I'm excited for the evening to get started. At this time, we want to direct your attention to the screen, where we're going to just show a brief video that really draws from some of the experience of our pastors from the very first conversation leading into this evening, and then Reverend Sofia will take us from here.
I think that it helps us to have that conversation in a public forum because it allows us room to learn from one another and to understand where another person is coming from and their experience with race in the city.
You know, we're better together than many of us are alone, right? And so when you look at our city being as spread out and diverse as it is, you can assume by not having familiarity that a narrative plays out a certain way. So from the north, you can look, say, to the south and assume some things. From the south, you can look to the north and assume some things. And I think what we found is, as we've come together and spent some time together, we had more in common than we may have thought originally. And to your point, we can learn from each other.
Well, I think Pastor Mills, he actually initiated the call. And so he came to our church over Bible Star. We sat down and we had some very poignant conversation about even beyond some of the topics of things that we discussed in the Race and Fresno series. We had some really personal conversations about his personal experience, my personal experience regarding race, how to deal with certain language that is common in our community, how we deal with how we approach one another, how we interact with one another. Like you said, we can call ourselves friends. We spend some time together. I think that we've also been in worship settings since being together. And so I think that if the Race and Fresno series has really just sparked a new, not just this, but new conversations throughout the city and helped us to dispel some of the assumptions that we may have had about other congregations and other communities in the past. It helped us to get past some of that.
I think doing a shared teaching context has helped. So we've done something together where we were both teaching. I walked in and I heard that voice and I know that guy. So this is the opportunity to feel like we're in some ways in this together and to recognize that the whole issue of race, I don't think it's solved in a panel discussion.
Right.
The tension is still there, even in the news of late, right? There's still a tension there. But to recognize that though we can't change the whole story, we can start little brush fires. Little brush fires of reconciliation that I think we can spread, and that's been the biggest thing for me, not just with Pastor Lewis, but with some of the other pastors that were on the panel too. Just getting together and realizing that these are good dudes who love Jesus. And boy, maybe we could partner together to share, to educate each other, to learn together, and to let it be a mutual learning experience. It's definitely not. I don't think it's one way. I think we're both learning together, and I think that's part of what makes it helpful.
I think my vision is similar to what we've already talked about, is that we expand on what we've already started, that we not lose the momentum that we already have as far as having conversations, that we broaden the scope of the conversations, and really come to the table and be willing to talk about some of the hard issues regarding race, and really look at some of the how race influences some of our decisions and choices and the systems that we have in our institutions, so in our community, and try to move past race and not allow race to be such a major player in how we form our decision making and policies in this community.
Take the chance, initiate, make a phone call. We have had so much fun, and we say we're friends. Don't misunderstand. We haven't barbecued with the families yet. We haven't done any of that yet. But we've broke some bread. We've shared some stories. We've had some closed-door, good, honest conversation. And I think, just personally, it's been very enriching. In fact, that was the primary takeaway from me, was the opportunity to get together with guys like this. And I would say, I just would encourage people to make a phone call. Because what you assume without making a phone call is that these people don't want to meet, they don't want to talk, they don't want to have serious dialogue, they don't care about those things. I think you'd be surprised. If you go and break bread with a guy who's got a different past and you different background, it might be really enriching. And I found it to be just a ton of fun. I think we've laughed more than anything, even in the short times that we've been together. And I think that's part of the problem. So I'd say, yeah, initiate, get together.
So thank you to Andrew. Can we also thank our pastors for that video? Good evening. I'm Reverend Sofia, as was mentioned before. How are we doing sound-wise? You can't hear me? All right, just a second.
Check, check. There we go. We're back on.
Is that better? Much better. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. This is such an important conversation. I would really like to invite our panelists to come up and find your seats, please. Can we give them a round of applause? Just getting last minute news. We're waiting on our last panelist. But in the meantime, I want to tell you that this evening's panel is a little bit different than the ones we've had before. We're focusing on 4 main questions. We've really heard that there's been a lot of content in the panels that we've already had, and we wanted to give our experts this evening time to really dialogue with one another. We've also reserved almost as much time for you to ask questions of our panelists as we have for the panel conversation itself. So we're going to spend half of our more formal time talking about the issue on the table, this intersection of questions of race and ethnicity and justice and the prison system. And we're going to spend the second half talking about possible solutions, possible ways of telling a new story together as a community. But I want you to be thinking about your questions and bringing them to the back as we ask, so that we can continue to have a dialogue as a group. And when we're done with the Q&A, you're going to have opportunities once again to gather together in small groups. But the point this evening is that we want to hear from you how you are feeling called to participate in the broader dialogue. This is the last of the 3 panel conversations. And so for both of our fantastic groups that keep us organized as communities of faith working together, we want to hear from the community itself. Where is your passion? We've had 3 panels on issues of race in our city. Where would you like to give some of your time, your energy, your prayers and hopes and vision for our community? So you'll have an opportunity to speak about that in small groups, and we're going to save a very little bit of time at the end to share those considerations, to share those concerns together. Does that sound good? Excellent. All right, I'm going to start by introducing our panelists that are with us, and hope that Pastor McBride gets here, who is currently a seminary student at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary. He has just about completed his master's degree in theology. Noah is interested particularly in conflict studies. He has a minor in psychology and works on educational issues in our broader communities. Sitting next to Noah is Stephanie Kamey. She is the Central Valley Regional Organizer with the ACLU of Northern California. Her expertise is in immigrant rights and African American community issues, both at the local, state, and federal levels, particularly focusing on issues of deportation, ICE holds, and the increase in Latino incarceration. Sitting on Stephanie's right is Reza Nekumanesh. Did I get that close? Not close. I apologize. All right. Reza is a graduate of Claremont School of Theology. He has a master's degree in Islamic leadership and serves as a volunteer at our Islamic Cultural Center. He's focused particularly this evening on the intersections of issues of race post 9/11 America and how that has had a negative effect on our Muslim community. He's also interested in how that dominant narrative, the stories that we tell, drive incarceration as is connected to the war on terrorism. To his right is Councilmember Oliver L. Baines III, who joined our Fresno City Council as the District 3 representative in January of 2011. Prior to his election to our City Council, he served as an officer with the Fresno Police Department for 11 years, where he was assigned to the problem-oriented policing unit in the Southwest District. He has helped to integrate parolees back into society, working with organizations such as the Gentlemen's Club and by mentoring youth. And from 2006 to 2010, he served as chair of Bringing Broken Neighborhoods Back to Life. This is a group that helps residents of crime-ridden neighborhoods to organize themselves to clear streets of gangs and violence. We're very grateful for all of your presence with us this evening. Let's have another round of applause. Now, as we're waiting for Pastor McBride, I'm just going to tell you that the Reverend Michael McBride is our national campaign organizer for PICO's Lifelines to Healings program. This is a comprehensive violence prevention and mass incarceration and life transformation campaign. That's a lot, but it sounds like very good work. This is led by hundreds of faith congregations throughout the United States. And over the past 15 years, Pastor McBride's commitment to holistic ministry can be seen through his leadership roles in both the church and community organizations like Bible Way Christian Center, the Racial Justice Coalition of California, the NAACP, the ACLU, the San Jose Interfaith Council, and others. We have a rich panel with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. It is my job to keep us on track tonight. I'm going to intervene mainly. I know this is a subject for which we all bring our passions and our commitments, so I'm going to try to keep us on track to ensure that we have time for dialogue as a community. I think Pastor McBride has arrived. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. You are just in time. It's fine. We are so glad that you are here. I have already introduced you, so you're just going to have to trust that I said good things. Bless you. Welcome, welcome. All right. So the way we've set this up, we have about 15 minutes per question as a panel. I'm going to ask our panelists to each give just a 1-minute response. This is very difficult when you're passionate about a topic. So I'm going to ask you to try your hardest to give us a quick, focused response so that we have time for you to dialogue as a group. All right? With the level of expertise we have in front of us, we felt it was important for our panel members to deepen their conversation by speaking with one another. All right, our first question. Drawing on your own lived experiences or knowledge of the prison industrial complex, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what do you feel is most important for us to understand as we consider together the impact of race on our criminal justice system? So just a brief word, when I say prison industrial complex, I'm talking about the idea that many organizers and scholars talk about, that the system itself is larger than everyone in it. They're talking about the overlapping interests of our government and the industry that regulates the prison system, that leads us to use surveillance, policing, imprisonment as our primary solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Okay, so I don't want to feed my answers to any of our panelists. The question again, drawing on your lived experiences or knowledge of the prison industrial complex, what do you feel, one primary thing that we should know as we consider together the impact of race on our criminal justice system? Pastor McBride, can I ask you anything?
I want to apologize for being late. It's horrible to affirm stereotypes, man. They say the black preachers are late to the party and the longest to talk, so I'll at least try to, not be too long-winded and intoxicating with the exuberance of my own verbosity. I'll try real hard not to. I think my first response, brief response to a very important question has to be grounded in the way we perceive the function of the criminal justice system, serving in our larger society. I think if it is indeed intended to demonstrate the blindness or the equal distribution of justice, then I think one of the things that at least our history and our research has begun to manifest is that when it comes to people of color, regardless of the kind of crimes that are committed, the kind of actions that are taken by the criminal justice system, even for acts that are the same, people of color tend to have a more harsh punishment and sentencing and even treatment by the system itself. So I think part and parcel of what we have to continue to wrestle and reckon with is what is the underlying cause of that, number one. And number two, what is our level of responsibility as a society and certainly as a nation that we can allow a system to run so unjustly for so long really rampant throughout particular parts of our community, and not do everything within our power to actually reverse that. And I think one of the big questions we have to continue to ask ourselves is, do we really believe that criminality is more an inherent quality of people of color, and thus requires the execution of the criminal justice system to be driven from that assumption and create more harsh and punitive punishment? Certainly, my experience working for quite some time in these communities, and in my community, is that I am perceived a threat to many agents of the criminal justice system just by my look. Now, I've never been arrested. Well, I have been arrested, but I was arrested by 2 white police officers and physically and sexually assaulted in 1999 when I was a Bible college student in San Jose. And these officers pretty much said that they did to me what they did because they needed to get home to their families every night. That I was considered a threat to them, and they treated me harshly, and they treated me with, I think, over-aggressive physicality that created trauma, certainly in me at that time, and it lingers to this day. And I think, my experience is that a lot of our young folk and people of color, all the way down even into the schools, have that experience, right, where we have the school-to-prison pipeline, or we have juvenile justice, or even the way criminal justice in the adult system perpetuates itself in that regard. So part of what I think our work has to be about is really coming to grips with the way the justice system is applied in communities of color, particularly among our communities that are perceived to be more criminal or outside the boundaries of the law, and begin to take a very important look at what are the underlying assumptions of that, thereby questioning and maybe even beginning to ask ourselves, do we really believe in the kind of inherent criminality that I think is an undergird, or at least an excuse that we tell ourselves why the criminal justice system acts this way. Very plainly stated, if talking about young black folk, if young black folk would just pull up their pants and stop committing so many crimes, then they wouldn't be in jail, right? And I think, I've heard that many times, and I think those kind of underlying assumptions actually help perpetuate the system in its present form, and we should be attempting to question those assumptions at every stop along the way if we're serious about addressing the over-incarceration of people of color in this country.
I would like to address the issue. I would like to address the issue of a society that you and I live in that takes incarceration, and I hate to use this word lightly, but lightly, in a word that, you know what, they're black, and I don't mean to offend anyone. They're just going to do it again. They've been on welfare. They live in this particular poverty. There are certain things that make and that establish and contribute to poverty other than just the color of your skin. There could be businesses that move out of town and people can move along with them, and so the housing market goes down, and so rent goes down, and people can rent who can afford those things. That can also make kind of what you would call a ghetto, so to speak, if I use that word loosely. Secondly, I see what's happening now in the movement of our young people, and I'm talking between maybe 8 and 18, who have learned, who have been brought up by parents, and I'm speaking Hispanically, who have been brought up by the age of 8 or 18 and even before that, who have not learned to speak Spanish very well. And they have not learned to speak English very well. And yet we pressure them with certain statistics and push them to do well. And if you don't, it's because you're dumb. It's not their father's fault. They learned what they learned, and they tried, and they did what they did. And they made, and they allowed those children to survive. Life is better than language. That is a grave concern for me. What do we do? What do we do with that, with a culture that has an influx of 12 million immigrants, not including Hispanics, come into this culture? I'm just reading this book right now where there was the Americans and there was the Mexicans, or the Indian Mexicans, and as they integrated, they became the Americans. Nobody thinks of that. And I'm not trying to push down on anyone. But we are the new America that is coming up. Let's embrace it. Let's hold it. Let's see what we can do together with that. Another thing, the third thing would be fear. There is fear. The third thing would be fear. Fear in incarceration. Fear in incarceration, it is run by fear. It is run by fear of the guards. It is run by fear of higher ups who have committed suicide, captains who have committed suicide. I did a 7 or 8.5 year term in state prison, of where I filed a lawsuit against the state because they were keeping me over, and I won my lawsuit, and they let me out. But fear runs that, and those particular things, those particular people are coming out to be your neighbor and my neighbor. And if we have no real rehabilitation, no community, what do you have?
Thank you. Panelists, I just want to remind you that we really want you talking to each other, so I'm going to ask you to give us one primary answer to this question, and please try to keep it brief.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I must admit, when I first read this question, impact of race on the criminal justice system, I kind of reversed it, where I thought of the impact of the criminal justice system on our race. And the first thing that came to mind when I thought of that was dehumanization. The way that the media plays in the United States, the way, the impact that this has on us, they're able to apply terms to us, illegals, especially for the Latino community, illegals, or, for any other community, criminals. And what that does really, it allows the people, with powers that, are in power, to incarcerate us. It's okay to put somebody who's a criminal away. You don't want them in your neighborhood. It's okay to put somebody who's illegal, they're illegal. So that was one of the things, those terms, the way we let society tell us and define us, really contributes to the dehumanization of our communities. And I think the criminal justice system plays a big part of that, especially when you mix it with, private prisons that are for profit. And you put all of these systems together, and it really causes for an unfair and unjust treatment of our communities.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say something that maybe you all know, maybe you don't. Islam, the religion, and Muslims are not a monolith. So unlike many groups in America, you can't look at somebody sometimes and say he's a Muslim. So tonight I'm going to be speaking on behalf of Muslims who may look like me or may have a name that, again, Sofia can't pronounce. But a few statistics and a few things about the way Muslims deal with the justice system or are dealt with in the justice system in America. First of all, 25% or so Muslims in America are black Muslims. So that's a whole nother issue, which I'm not going to be able to represent, but they have two issues that they have to deal with when they're being faced by police officers and in the courts and then in the prisons. But 72% of Muslims are immigrants or children of immigrants. So they may look like me or may have a name like me. And because of that, they become targeted. And then they end up losing out on some of the justices or the fairness that may exist for other people who don't have the same problem. Those people who come here are immigrants or are children of immigrants. They are living in a culture and in a community that they might have so many barriers. They have language barrier, they have a cultural barrier. They might have fear of the police, maybe because of what happened here, or probably more so because they know what happened to their parents or what will happen to you in their home countries if you are dealt with by police, which would be very harsh. The best intentioned person in this world, the best intentioned system in this world is not colorblind and is not blind. And when somebody is pulled over and somebody is in a courtroom, when somebody is in a prison, you cannot say that I don't know what you are or what you look like or what you might believe or who you may be. And unfortunately, because of many things, the history of our country, the way it developed, and things that have gone on over the last, many years, and particularly since 9/11 for Muslims, there's not just one justice system in America. There's a justice system if you're white. There's a justice system if you're rich. There's a justice system if you're poor. There's a justice system if you're black. And there's a justice system if you're a Muslim. And I will say something that I didn't know, but I would like you to think about. So I didn't realize, because a good number of those, maybe not a majority or even not even a strong minority, but a good number of them are there solely because what they look like or what they believe. Thank you.
Thank you. These are very in-depth questions, and I'm going to be honest. I've chatted with our moderator before we started. I'm going to make every attempt possible to narrow my focus on these questions down. But we're really highlighting one system in our country that disproportionately affects people of color. But quite honestly, just about every system in our country disproportionately affects people of color, and all of these systems actually are connected. So I'm going to try my best to focus on the prison system, but it's much, much broader than that. And if we're going to be very honest tonight, I'm hoping that the dialogue will shift somewhat. But just to really, in the briefest way possible for me, most of you know I'm an elected official, so I can go on and on. So in the briefest way possible for me to answer this question, one of the ways that the disproportionate way that the prison system affects people of color is really the families, in my opinion. Drawn upon my experience in law enforcement, and while I say that, let me proclaim that I am no expert at all in the prison system. So everything that I talk about tonight will be from an experience that I've gained just through life, not from being an expert in the prison system. But I can tell you that our families, people of color, when you have people that are in prison, are affected in such a negative way, and it perpetuates the cycle of poverty that our families, people of color's families, are afflicted by year after year after year. When you talk about the inability to procure a quality education, when you talk about the inability to vote, to be a part of the larger systems in our society. Incarceration does that to a family. It is an absolute disruptor of a family. And so while the majority population, white America at times, wonders why people of color stay in these conditions, why you see these gaps in every metric in society. Every metric of society, there's a gap for people of color and Caucasians. Well, the prison system, is one of those institutions that continues to perpetuate that gap. And it's because of what it does to the families. It disallows for our families to be whole and to heal and to have the benefits of what families should have in this country. I'm going to end my remarks there for this question because I want to certainly allow the panel to get there.
Thank all of you. I have this very difficult job. I am going to move us to the next question because we are over time. So I'm going to remind you again, and this is an impossible request, to try to keep focused on one particular piece of information so we can have some crosstalk. And if we don't get there, I'm okay with that. But I want to defend time for questions and small group dialogues as well. Okay, so our second question. What are the dominant narratives that drive the incarceration rates of people in our country or are used to justify the disproportionate sentencing or representation that some of you have talked about? So I just want to say very briefly, I think it's really important for us to remember that California is consistently a state with one of the highest rates of incarceration in the nation. So this is a personal issue for us in the Valley. And I looked at 3:38 p.m. because the numbers keep going up. There were 2,862 individuals in Fresno County alone who were incarcerated. So the question really is, what are the stories that are used to justify these inequalities that we've been talking about and that keep us from responding as a community sometimes? So maybe one. What is one commonly told stereotype, dominant narrative story that keeps us from having this conversation? Councilmember Baines, can I ask you to start us this time?
Sure. So I can tell you that I actually believe that there is a perception that exists in society about, and I'm gonna talk about African Americans right now, that we are very different culturally than whites and even Latinos and Asians and every other culture. And I'll use this example quickly. I'm running for re-election. I was at a fundraising event just a couple of weeks ago, talking to a very nice white man whom I have a relationship with, and we were talking about our families. I was talking to his wife we were talking about mothers, and just because of the way the conversation was, we were talking about mothers. And he asked me, and very innocently, by the way, if my father raised me. My father was in my home with me. Now, of course, my father was, in case you guys are wondering, I was raised by a two-parent home. But the idea that he had was that I did not. And so I use that as an example because I actually believe that's very telling. The fact that I don't believe he would have asked a white person that question. To be very frank with you. I believe he asked me that question because I'm African American. And there's a perception among people that African Americans are raised in single parent households, that we are ghetto, and that there are certain stigmas that come along with being black. And I'm gonna tell you something, the interesting thing about that perception is it's not just held by white people. It's also held by black people. So the issue, I think, is the perception of who blacks are in this society. We have to not only unravel what white society thinks, but we have to actually unravel what we think. And to my young African Americans that are out there, next time you're with your friends and you hear one of your other African American friends say that someone is acting black, stop and ask yourself what you mean and what did you just say, right? Because that perception exists. And so I think that the problem starts with the perception.
So one theme that I would like to bring up, and unfortunately I can only tell you that a parallel exists, and you're going to have to do the research for yourself because I don't have that much time, but we all know that the war on drugs has created a great rift in the justice system, in the way that people are tried, in the way that people receive their sentencing, and many a time, most of the time, along racial bases. So the parallel I draw is with the war on terror. In the name of war on terror, things like probable cause, due process, fair trial, and even humane imprisonment have all been thrown out the window for many people, simply because of things that they believe. So while they might seem like a stretch, war on drugs and war on terror, the way that they play out in the justice system, there's a very real connection in about the way that different people are seen when they stand before a judge. You know, do you have 5 grams of crack or 500 grams of cocaine? And that's the same penalty for both, right? So when you stand before a judge, who did you donate money to 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Because a lot of Muslims have been jailed because of people, because they've donated to organizations. You know, somebody comes with a flyer or a leaflet and says, I'm feeding hungry kids in any country, pick a country. You know, a lot of people will just give money. And many people over the years, many have been released, but many people have been thrown in jail just for their history of donation. And it's because when they stand before the judge, they're seen, the probability is that you are either a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer, and not that you just wanted to donate money to help out those children. So my parallel would be between the war on drugs and the war on terror.
I think coming from the immigrant, representing the immigrant community, it kind of have to be a combination of what the rest panelists have already spoken about, which is perception and also the way the justice system works for us. So, he's just said how in certain systems, they don't get due process, right? In the immigration system, it's the same. They don't get to they have the right to see an attorney, but they don't get one provided for them by the government. Now, there are certain crimes that call for mandatory detention. And you think about that, mandatory detention, that just sounds messed up. I mean, it's really messed up because it's the same thing where, a certain crime that might not be a felony, even in our criminal justice system, would be considered something that's a mandatory detention for an immigrant, just because they do not have documents and they don't have legal status here. So I think one of the dominant narratives that drives this, that causes us to be able, is what the media has told us about the attrition strategy, about making immigrants' lives here so horrible that they'll want to self-deport and they'll want to just leave the country. Excuse me. That's something that really bothers me, of course, because people seem to forget that it doesn't matter what your status is, we are people and we are here. And when you come from the community like the Central Valley, you see that the people here are hardworking. We take pride in being the people who put food on the table, that work the fields, that do things that a lot of other people won't do, and do it with pride, and we do it for a lot less than other people do, less than minimum wage. We're out there in the fields in 115-degree weather, working all the time, and because you can call, some of the immigrants illegal, it's okay. All of a sudden, we're not humans. All of a sudden, we don't have rights. All of a sudden, we're not just like everybody else because of our skin color, because of our documentation. So, I think that's something important to consider when thinking about that, the way we are able to label people and then make it seem like it's okay just because of what those labels are.
One of the things as part of the narrative is the sentencing and the representation is kind of, she mentioned, representation is virtually nothing. Representation for me, as I was going to prison, was virtually just a guy who would come pretty much and say, hi, hey, how you doing? This is what's going to be next. And so, hey, we'll see you later. Did you do it? Did you not do it? But the facts. Who was there? What can you say about this? None of those questions were asked in terms of the narrative. In terms of a dominant narrative, it's different for different people. But I did want to get this point in here. There are prison guards who work in there, and we think that they work in there and do their jobs. This is also, I believe, part of a narrative that we have to consider, because there are prisoners who work in there and they see their children on visiting day. The prison guards live there 8 to 16 hours a day. Context affects you, and you take that home with you, and you affect your children, just like the prisoner does. So it's almost a no-win situation. I'm not trying to be just pessimistic, but if context affects, you know, and I'm not saying it's not a good job, it's a good paying job, but you're bringing things home with you, you're bringing stress home with you. But again, for the more impact on that, it's just really the lack of representation for everyone, no matter what color, and the larger sentencing for some people with the same crime.
So many narratives run through my mind. You know, one narrative is that black males are dangerous and violent. Latinos are coming to take my jobs. Muslims are terrorists. Elected officials don't get anything done. I'm just playing. So many narratives, right? But I think if I were to pick one dominant narrative, it would be a narrative of fear. And I think when you are fearful or driven by fear or controlled by fear, you will believe irrational things. And you will do irrational things. You will suspend common sense when you are driven by fear. And I think, our country has a dominant narrative that is fear-based. And certainly as a follower of Jesus and a gospel preacher, one of the biblical texts remind us that perfect love casts out fear. So part of what I believe, one of the things we have to begin to wrestle with is, you can make a choice to be fearful and retreat, or love and lean in, right? And I think the more we lean in, the more we find out that regardless of our categories or labels, there is much more we have in common with each other that actually allows us to overcome, or at least act in ways that acknowledge the way fear as a dominant narrative colors the way we interact with one another. And I think I find that in a lot of the work we do, one of our most primary goals is how do we overcome the fear of one another that is often based out of ignorance, lack of relationship, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask that we take our third question simply as a dialogue. So I'm not going to ask each one of you to respond. I'm going to ask you to have some conversation about it. We've talked a little bit about what some of the problems are. And we talked about the stories that not just drive those problems, but actually keep the problems going. That's what a dominant narrative means. The stories that we tell ourselves and each other that keep the problems in place. So the third question is really simple. I wish it was as simple to answer as it was to say. What solutions might allow us a way forward as a nation? By solutions, I'm really talking about the ways that we tell news stories, How do we get those new stories represented in our policies? What's the work that's already being done? Is there some kind of a vision of restorative justice that looks and sounds different that we should be talking about as a nation? So I'm going to invite you to have a popcorn-style conversation. I'm only going to get involved if someone gets really impassioned in dialogue.
Well, I can certainly start off. I think one of the ways that we've tried to address these kind of fear-based narratives is put people in deeper relationship with each other around problem solving and solutions that actually confront the dominant narrative. Much of our work across the country has been around reducing gun violence and kind of taking the sting out of the assumption that people of color are to be feared. We find that when we interact with particularly those populations of individuals who are the highest volume firearm offenders, if you will, that a quality and sustained interaction with them actually reduces their behavior or lifestyle around those particular acts. And I think what that has done for us is that it has put us in relationship with young people and families and even communities that are often thought to be feared. And we see that these young people and families want to live just like the rest of us. So I do think the more, particularly people of faith, gather in these shared spaces, learn each other's stories, and confront those fears and be willing to kind of step in some, to use Paul's term, dung, if I were to use American terms, crap, poo-poo, S-H-I-T. I'm not a cussing preacher, but I think y'all get my point, right? Like, we have to be willing to, like, step in it in order to actually overcome some of these taboos or fears that we have one with another. And I think that may be one of the first steps.
Yeah. I'll try to keep it short. I would like you to, I really love the Hebrew language, and I really love the Hebrew context and the history. Some of you have probably gone to church, and some of you probably haven't. And this is going to be interesting coming from a guy wearing a cowboy hat. But, nevertheless, there is a word that the Hebrew people use called Adonai. Have you ever heard of that? Adonai. It means my Lord and my Master. There is different derivatives of this. There is one called Adoni. So Adoni is almost like saying, hello, sir, with respect. Hello, sir. So, when I say shalom, have you ever heard of the word shalom? That means peace, perfect peace. When you say shalom, Adoni, because the Jewish people use Adonai only when they do their prayers while they're by themselves. They use the word Hashem when they're doing public prayer. Hashem, Ha is the definite article, and Shem means name. That's where we get the name Shemot. Or that's another story. So if I was playing publicly right now, I would say, Baruch atah Shetem, praise the name of God. But I wouldn't say the name of God. So when they pray by themselves, they use the word Adoni. But if I salute you or say hi to you, I respect you as the image of God. So I can't say Hashem to you. So I say, peace, Adoni. What that means is peace to you, you who are made in the image of God. Now, can you imagine if each one of us told someone that? Peace to you, you who are made in the image of God. No matter your color, no matter your age, no matter your disability, no matter what age you are, ethnic you are, peace to you who are made in the image of God. Wow, that blows my mind. Because I know who you belong to, and I wouldn't want to hurt you.
I myself do happen to be religious, but I don't want to play off of that tonight. I think what he was really playing to, what I heard really was just being inclusive of our community. And the question was, how do we tell a new story? Well, I think it's by telling a new story. It's not just about hearing, the bulldog with the tattoos and who committed X, Y, and Z crime. It's also about, the Latino or Black student that got a 4.0 in college and graduated high school and has all of these things, and not to see them as an exception, but to see that these are people that are in our community, and not only the ones that have all these great, GPAs and who are awesome, quote unquote, but the people who are still active members of our community, that come from our community, that it's only because of how we have labeled them, because of the criminal justice system, because of the systems already in place, institutionalized before we were born, that we are, considered bad or not successful. And I think that's how we start. We start by sharing those stories. We start by getting to know each other, accepting people for who they are, respecting people as people, and sharing those stories between communities, sharing how, the difference in cultures, and being able to work together to tell the people who can make these laws in our country and get them to understand our world, get them to see where we come from and why we struggle, and that these institutions actually exist. Because what I found is a lot of these legislators, they live in their own bubble and they don't really know what the hell goes on the ground. They don't really know what we go through at home. And so I think that's part of moving forward as a nation. It's being inclusive, talking to each other, regardless of what you look like, what you believe in, who you believe in, where you went to school, what hood you grew up in, what color you are, anything. I think it's really working together and starting to have these conversations, honest conversations like the ones we're attempting to have now, and have the commitment to work together to improve the way of life and improve the vision of this nation.
So I'm hearing a lot about inclusion, about sharing stories, about honoring God or honoring the best in each one of us. Can you tell us something about ways that some of our organizing groups are already doing that work? What is happening on the ground already that is starting to change our story? And I would ask if those of you who haven't spoken yet have an answer to that. I'd like to prioritize.
Okay. So Reverend Sofia, in the question, she brought up the word restorative justice. And it's not a generic term. There's a lot of scholarship and study that's gone into this and how it can really change people. I'm going to give you a quote by a famous Muslim American scholar. You don't usually think of him that way. Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, who was popularly known as Malcolm X. He said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6, paraphrasing, you didn't do anything. And even if you pull it out all the way, you haven't really made a change. You have to heal my wound for us to make any change. So what are different organizations doing? I think we're all sitting in this room. And with our differences and with what we believe, you might hate what I believe. You might not even know what I believe. But the fact that we're willing to come together in a room and talk and try to come to some common understanding, that's starting to heal the wound. And the justice system isn't an abstract thing. I brought up the justice system earlier. But it's made up of people. People like you and me, people who come into positions of power, and people who execute those powers on other people. So groups like this that get together, churches that meet and get together, especially churches who meet with churches who believe something different than they believe, or look different than how they believe, that's true restorative justice, because there are victims that are hurt and they're feeling pain. And maybe the knife has been pulled out, but that wound has to be healed before you can move past anything. It's hard to look at somebody knowing that I still have a gash in my side. So, what are we doing? We're here. We're here, Reverend Sofia. We're here. We're here together, and there's nothing more powerful than people getting together on a night that you might want to go do something else. You might want to be out with your family or friends, but you got together for a reason. You got together because you know there's a problem, and you know that a way to get past this problem is for us to get together, to coalesce. I used it wrong. But for us to get together and work towards something better, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of healing, and it's going to take a lot of handshaking and looking at each other as something more than just somebody other than me, but somebody just like me.
So I think on this question, are we still talking about the pathway, the solutions to the ways forward?
We are. We
Okay.
seem to be transitioning a little bit into our fourth question, but that's okay.
No, I won't. I just wanted to make sure I was still in the right place.
You are.
So for me to answer this question, as I visualize it in my mind, I'm going to need to go really broad with you all for a moment, but I promise to narrow it in. Because when you're talking about solutions and a pathway forward, in some of my opening remarks, I let you all know and I warned you that I believe that the problem is institutionally across this nation. So when you're asking about the pathway forward, in my opinion, in reality, you cannot do that unless you are prepared to address every institution in this nation and the injustice that exists in them all. And why is that? Why do we have that? Why are we in this situation today? And I'm gonna take you all back really briefly to the founding of this country. And I'm gonna be very, very honest, this country, since its inception, wasn't necessarily founded on the principle that everyone would share in equality, right? And I think if we're being honest, we know that. That is the philosophy, and that is the theory, and that is the idea. But it has not been like that since the beginning of America. So we're challenged from the beginning. Our documents say that, and luckily our documents, the founding documents of this country, protect us and allow us a pathway forward. But the men that were interpreting these documents didn't always see in America for me. Right? So that's our problem. It's in the beginning. Now, we've come a long way. I don't want to pretend like we're still in 1776, because we are not there right now. There have been multiple transitions. If you remember, in 1865, obviously we fought a civil war and we ended slavery. And so what happened after we ended slavery is this country really went into a way to continue to institutionalize racism. That's when it began, after slavery was ended, because the majority of this country had to find a way to continue to keep people of color in bondage. So that happened. So since then, we've really been trying to come out of that. And so I told you I was going to really broad to tell you to come really narrow. Or not really narrow, but narrow enough. In order to go forward, we're going to have to really change the institutional issues that exist in all of our institutions. But we all in this room can't do that, so I don't want to charge you with that. But what we can do is we can focus on a few institutions. A couple of them I think that are key and that are vital is our educational system. I think that if we as a community were to focus on quality education for all of our students, we'd be making major, major strides and gains. And you all know why. I actually don't need to tell this group why education is important, because you all know. But we also know there's great disparity that exists there right now. Another institution is the justice system. And that the justice system is really made up of some key institutions: law enforcement, the judicial system, and our correctional system, which we know are disproportionately affecting people of color, which help, in my mind, perpetuate the cycle of poverty, as does education. So I think a pathway forward was if groups like this and people who had the means focused on a couple of key institutions and systems and sought to change them, sought to bring them into equality, into parity for all, we would see major gains.
Yes, awesome. So another thing, maybe it's a line of work that I do, but I think what faith communities and other communities in the Central Valley are already doing and across the nation, it's really important to me, is voting, is, putting the pressure on our legislators to do what we want. When we want to change the institutions, we have what we call democracy in the United States. I think it's a economic dictatorship, but that's my personal opinion. And so we have the ability to vote. Even if you don't, you can talk to people to vote. And I think that's one of the things to focus on, because I think when it comes to the criminal justice system, part of the way that one of the dominant narratives keeps us from getting what we want and having true equality is by keeping us from voting. Whether, it be the criminal records and felonies or being undocumented, these are all laws that keep us from being able to partake in our system, and I think they're unjust laws. So that's a place that we need to start. I think that we need to start using the system that we already have in place and start using ourselves to change it to our advantage and to be able to partake in it and change our communities, change the way we look at civic engagement. And, on June 3rd, it's an election day. If every church that got together and they all went to vote, you don't know the difference it would make, especially in the Central Valley when things like voting are so low, our turnout rates are ridiculous. So if people who can vote, that already right now today can actually vote, if they just went to the ballot to choose somebody who believes a little bit more in what they believe in, even if their views aren't perfect, I think that's a place to start.
Thank you. So we've already heard a little bit about this, but our fourth question is, what do we need from the faith communities? And I don't mean writ large, I mean, what are we uniquely suited to do in our communities of faith? How do we maximize the gifts that we bring across our variety of beliefs and backgrounds and journeys together? What can faith communities do that secular institutions don't do as well? How do you need us to show up first to address some of these issues? Basically.
Something very simple. Those people of faith, any of you that are people of faith, we usually look to those religious leaders in our organizations as somebody we want to follow, right? Or else we wouldn't go there. We wouldn't go and listen to somebody that we didn't think was a good example. Now what happens if that good example is teaching hatred? Or if that good example is teaching us not to be accepting or to be exclusionary? How do you think that our world would end up? Because a lot of faith leaders, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, that's what they're doing. So we need to put pressure on our organizations, because we get to, through our sheer numbers in our organization, we get to decide who leads us, right? They don't just all of a sudden pop out and say, hey, here's a salary, come lead us. No, because they are chosen, because they fit within our view, and if they're not, we can push them out. But putting pressure on our leaders to educate the people, are you saying you're going to push them out? Is that what's going on over here? But just making sure that our centers our centers of education, it goes back to education, and our centers are another place where we learn so much, we're guided so much. We go to seek solace, and we go to seek answers. And if we're going to seek answers in a place that is cutting us off from the rest of the world, then restorative justice is not in our cards, it's not real. So we need to pressure our leaders to teach us justice, restorative justice, and acceptance.
I think, just to piggyback on that, I think all of us in the faith community can do a better job of finding what we share in common and building upon that, and not focusing on what we don't have in common. And I think that, the interesting thing about all of our faith traditions, if you take them seriously, they will have some divergent opinions or beliefs, but I think if you also take them seriously, there are common themes of justice and common themes of forgiveness and common themes of sacrificial living, all kinds of things that if we lived those themes out and sought out those folk who shared those same assumptions, we could really make a profound impact. We need the right bodies. And if we get the right bodies, we'll get more bodies. And after a while, we'll have enough bodies. So I do believe that part of our task as people of faith, people of goodwill, is to build on what we have in common, and then be intentional about building relationships and having conversations that accentuate the common good, and then work out of that. And I think if we can do that, we can find these examples where we may agree upon how we would dismantle the incarceration system, or how we would improve the education system. We can find those common principles and then leverage all of our collective influence to bring the moral influence we have to bear upon all of these issues we're addressing.
Thank you.
I think one of the logisticals for me is the language barrier when it comes to most Catholic and evangelical communities here. They're usually Latino and they speak Spanish, and any other faith community that may not speak Spanish. I think trying to overcome these barriers, I think we've had a lot more difficult barriers in both communities to overcome. And besides, just the language between English and Spanish and any other language, I think we have to understand that we all share a common language, and language of love, and especially in the faith community, the language of God. And so using that language that we already have, using the power that we have with each other, to overcome that barrier, to be intentional about who you talk to and how to do it, and to merge these two communities and other communities as well to further the relationships that we have and be able to work together. So I think being very intentional, going into a different community that you might not go to, and talking to them and doing your best to try to understand. I mean, it's a melting pot of ethnicities and races and people of color here. So I think trying to really do your best to communicate with them and show who you are as a person, I think would be a great start for this.
Thank you all so much. I do have some questions from the audience. If you want to give a round of applause for very thoughtful, that'd be wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and for speaking to difficult truths. What I'm going to ask that we do during the question and answer period, if you feel that you have particular expertise on the question that's being asked, I do have a few that are specific to a couple of you. Will you just indicate that to me? I don't need responses from everyone on every question. Here's our first question. Given the role of stand your ground laws in the cases of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis, and the way that the National Rifle Association came to the defense of the shooters in both cases, what role do you think gun rights and gun control issues play in race and the prison system, if any?
So I think what's super important to appreciate about the way the NRA has been publicly described is often very different than how the overwhelming majority of NRA members actually identify or talk about themselves when they are interviewed or polled. Some of these common sense gun laws that have been being talked about for quite some time have universal support, an overwhelmingly majority of support of NRA members, whether it's background checks, whether it's resistance to some of these standard ground laws. And I think there's often a distinguishing we must do between the NRA executives and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. that tend to, I think, hijack some of these conversations and take us down rabbit holes of irrational and fear-based thinking. And I think one of the things that we can call on NRA members to do is to speak up and actually voice that some of these common sense gun laws that we're talking about, regardless of whether you imagine or believe it will have an impact on reducing some of these incidents of violent crime, we all largely agree. The background check bill that came through was 90% agreeable in the country, and I think 75% agreeable from NRA members themselves. I think part of what we have to continue to pay attention to, which is so important, is if we are again driven by fear, and if we allow folks to perpetrate these fear-based narratives, then I think when incidents like Stand Your Ground happen, it allows us to not be truthful about what exactly is really going on. And part of what I think, again, I believe people of faith everywhere need to prioritize life at all times, right? And figure out how do we create situations where people's lives can be saved, even when we are fed these narratives about who's dangerous and who's not, and who should have a gun and who should not. What does it mean, or what would it mean for every follower? I tell all of my friends all the time who love guns and those who don't, why do people who serve the Prince of Peace seem to be so obsessed with owning a piece, right? Should we actually be thinking differently about what it means for us to prioritize life over some of these other kinds of narratives that are propagated all across the country? And again, our work nationally, we do indeed work very closely with a lot of folks on the conservative side of the argument who do not necessarily believe that these kind of changes in overarching kind of policy make a difference. But when you kind of drill down, we all still tend to agree that some of these policies are not really kind of serving the common good. And I think it is in that space that we all should really enter and then challenge our leaders, whether they're in the NRA, in our pulpits, in our communities. Let's go for the common good and see if we can actually get to a resolution that actually makes us all safer and really prioritizes the lives of all people.
Thank you.
Okay, I may have a slightly different opinion of that. I'm not exactly sure that the problem with the two cases, and for the person that asked the question, were the laws, the Stand Your Ground laws per se. These people were murderers. And the problem is, some kind of way, jurors did not view the victims as being real victims, which I begin comes back to the justice system and the perception of people of color in this country. So to me, the problem isn't necessarily the law. These folks were murderers. They were carrying guns and they killed unarmed people. I'm not going to retry these cases here, but the problem is, how do the juries not see that? What happened in the mind of a juror to think that a teenage boy, unarmed, can be killed like that? That was a murder. That was not the use of a stand your ground. And so, until we begin to get at the root of these perceptions, until human beings are willing to see people of color as human beings and give them the same rights and protections, we're going to continue to have these problems. And listen, the problem isn't getting rid of the Stand Your Ground law, because another law will be enacted that will be like Stand Your Ground. That's all that's going to happen. And so I think that we need to start calling it what it was. That was a murder, and it wasn't the fault of the law, in my opinion.
Dr. King says that laws will not make you love me, but they will keep you from killing me.
Yes.
So I do believe that, laws are not a silver bullet, but let us remember that laws institutionalize our values. They reinforce what we believe, and in many ways create a pretext for much of our actions. So I do believe that it is important for us, while we acknowledge the kind of, flawed and perverted thinking that, folks may have as relates to, young people, people of color, other people, etc., that laws create an opportunity for our irrational thinking and behavior oftentimes to be justified and then mimicked in other places. If Stand Your Ground was not that big of a deal, many more states would not be trying to implement it with the funding of the private prison industry, with the funding of the NRA and other organizations that tend to criminalize and lock up people of color. So I would just like to nuance that just a little bit. Certainly I don't think it was the total reason, but I don't think we should ignore the impact that policy and law does indeed play in the way we institutionalize a lot of our unconscious bias and racial anxiety.
Okay, thank you. I want to say one thing. There's research that tells us that you have to hear a new story as many times as you heard the old one before you start telling the new story as if you believe it. It's one of the things I think we can do in our communities of faith, is tell a new story well. I'm going to put our questions slightly out of order just to give more people a chance to talk. So, to what extent does the prison industrial complex, which employs prisoners at extremely low wages to build material goods for the state, like office furniture, highway signs, for example, to what extent does that take jobs away from the economy? No, sorry. To what extent does that take away jobs from the economy that employs non-incarcerated individuals? I'm going to try to ask for someone who hasn't spoken yet, unless you don't feel like that's a question you want to speak to.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, so very quickly, the prison system employs prisoners at extremely low wages to build material goods for the state. To what extent does that take jobs away from the economy that would otherwise employ non-incarcerated people?
If I could take that, I think that there's a lot of people who can and are willing to work and who are looking for work. However, the state has implemented a way to save money for the institution. So it's cheap labor. My 7 years of prison, I started off at 12 cents an hour. And then I got a raise after that, which bumped me up to 15 cents an hour. And that almost was a joke to me, but it was the only income I had coming in. That does not help any of the state of California and its revenue, and it doesn't contribute to the taxes that the hardworking people are paying to that. It doesn't contribute to it. It stays in the pocket of the government, of the institution. Where does it go? I don't know. But at 12 cents an hour, you figure you make, 8 something an hour, take away 12 cents. That leaves you $8. $8 times 10, that's $80. Times, you could just go on and up to $800. And I'm not saying someone's pocketing that money, but at the same time I am.
Thank you.
But, there is other efficient ways that can be implemented to do that, to have a right for, it comes down to a justice system. If I want to treat you like a slave, then I'm going to treat you like a slave. If I want to treat you like a human being and you've done something wrong, I'm going to treat you like a human being, and yes, you're paying your debt to society. However, on that hand, society never lets you forget. They quit paying you, but they never let you forget.
The next question is for you. Is it burning on this topic?
I'll just give you a text to read that will give you all, I think, very, you can read on your own. It is written by Letha C. and Nancy Kashan, and it's called Violence as Seen Through a Prism of Color. But parts of their book are chapters on the profits that Fortune 500 companies make off of the labor of prisoners. And you will be just surprised to see the Fortune 500 companies on this list: McDonald's, AT&T, Victoria's Secrets, Target, Macy's, Merrill Lynch. I mean, on and on and on. And I think if you imagine that $30 million of private prison labor is being attributed to many of these Fortune 500 companies, of course we can imagine that that is killing industry outside of or in many of our communities. One concrete example in Louisiana, every single uniform that the state employees in the state of Louisiana wear are made inside the Louisiana correctional system. That literally means that it put every single textile and uniform making company in the state of Louisiana out of business. So it's important for us to appreciate that slave labor inside the prisons is not only reenacting a certain kind of economic slavery system, but is also impacting many of us on the outside who are looking for quality, livable wage jobs. They are very much connected.
Also,
No, I have to move on. Sorry, I do have to move on. So my next question is for, again, Pastor Mike. Can you speak to us about the school-to-prison pipeline?
I'll give you an anecdote. I worked as a counselor in the schools for a number of years. In our school, in the school district of Berkeley, the place that is the bastion of all that is liberal and progressive, somebody say amen, right? They were literally suspending and expelling black males without any due process. Now, what happened and what that means is that, students would get charged with some kind of a offense, whether it is being defiant in class or cutting school or whatever, possessing drugs. And without sending it to a hearing, they were actually suspending and expelling the kids. Because the kids were not in school, of course, they were more likely to be in the neighborhoods or out in the community engaging in behavior that is unsavory or would land them more likely to have contact with prisons with law enforcement officials. Even in the schools, there are tons and tons of research that show that the over-disciplined nature of how kids of color are treated in the schools creates this certain kind of reinforcement and pathology around how young people even see themselves, which causes them to have out-of-school time or out-of-class time, causes them to be more likely to, be in the principal's office and all these different kinds of things. The school-to-prison pipeline then is the way that experience has pretty much been written in shorthand. It is the systematic over-discipline and criminalization of children. And I think we need to keep saying that. These are children. Even if you're in high school, you're a child. You are a minor. It is the systematic over-criminalization of children, which then puts them prematurely in contact with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, which then gets them on paper, as we say in the community, or on probation, which makes it so much easier then for them to never get out of the criminal justice system. It is something that we have to continue to push back against. California has been leading the charge in some of these very important reforms that include making sure that we do not expel kids because of defiance in the classroom, making sure we do not have more police officers in the schools, more than counselors, that we actually make sure that schools are places of learning and not security lockup centers that prepare the children for a future that none of us want them to be a part of.
There's a great book that was written called The School to Prison Pipeline. So if you haven't read it, you need to read it. And an alarming statistic, I'm not talking about disciplinary actions or people who are kicked out of school, but there's an alarming statistic that prison funding is tied directly to the third grade reading level. So they pull funding into prisons according to the community's third grader reading level, 8-year-olds.
I think one other thing to consider too is just, a statistic that when you suspend somebody, you kick them out of class, that student is now.
System, and I really don't know how they make those decisions. I wish I had if I went on any further than that, I'd be just guessing, but I don't know. I would assume that we would have to engage the county board during their budget times to figure out how to increase the funding for that.
Yeah, so we've, as the ACLU, have been looking at the public defender's office here in Fresno County, and I mean, it's just greatly understaffed. The public defenders don't really have the capacity to do what they should do, and it's really not something that, I think if you've ever gone through the criminal justice system, a lot of people, they're like, well, my public defender was an ish, they didn't do what they needed to do to get me the proper, representation. But the problem isn't the public defender, the problem is the system and the way they have the staff members, their capacity, their caseloads. The problem starts at the board of supervisors and the way they give the money to the district attorney's office to prosecute and not to the public defender's office. So I think I didn't really hear the question right, but I was talking about the public defenders. And so I think it's really important for us as a community, to talk to our board of supervisors to give that appropriate budget so that they can actually do their job that they're supposed to do for us. And I think it's very important, especially for the immigrant community, because, like I said earlier, in the immigration system, they're not guaranteed representation. So a lot of the time, the public defender is the last attorney they will ever see. And if that person is not equipped to understand, all of the disparities between the criminal justice system and the immigration system and all of these other systems, then it really does, it's a violation of our rights. It's a violation of our constitutional rights to have representation here in the United States.
Thank you. So I do have one last question, but we've kind of caught up. No, I feel bad that I silenced you earlier because I was worried about time. Is there still something you'd like to add to that previous question? Do you remember what it was that you wanted to say?
Oh, no. I don't remember what it was.
All right.
And there was a small comment about the public defender's office that I wish I could share. I think that one of the better equipped and one of the better paying jobs, I'm tongue-tied here, could be compared, should be the public defender's office, because our law states that you're innocent until proven guilty, and that seems to have reversed. You're guilty until you're proven innocent, as long as you have the look. You have the look, and you know what? Yeah, that guy probably did that. You were the third row, second seat, fourth back. You did it. You know what? You're wearing that blue shirt and that white collar shows. That doesn't make sense to me. It is almost like sometimes in our school system, teachers are underpaid. They're asked to use some of their own funding for some of their own curriculum. These should be our priorities for our future America, if this is where we're headed.
Thank you. Panel members, our last question. It's probably the difficult question to answer, but I'm going to ask you to take it on in good faith. So the question is, what role does institutional racism, by this we mean racial bias that is backed up by power in the system, right? So this is not individual prejudice, it is how bias is lived out and reinscribed by our structures and systems. All right, sorry. What role does institutional racism play in dictating the behaviors of law enforcement?
Gotta start. When I first went into prison, I was shipped to a place where you wait. It's a level 3 prison, which is pretty tough prison. You don't say anything to anybody unless you mean it. If you insult somebody, you get a piece of steel. I don't mean to be graphic about that, but that's just the way it's run. Nobody says anything, you just feel the steel. I was asked by law enforcement, who do you run with? I said, I don't run with anybody. You have to run with somebody. There's a line behind me of about 20 inmates. I said, I don't run with anybody. Look, you have to run with somebody. I have to put you on a bed or in a cell. Who do you run with? I don't run with anybody. I said, you know what? You make the decision. And if anything happens, it's your fault. Because I don't run with anybody. I walk by myself. I'm not in a prison gang, and that's not what I'm here for. So that was my first experience. The law enforcement runs who you run with. They tell you who you can be categorized with according to your look, according to your geographic. If you're north, if you're south, if you're black, if you're white, if you're bulldog, if you're not bulldog, if you're shark, if you're not a shark, if you're a polar bear, if you're all these different things. And it's not a zoo, it's just that there's nicknames for all those things. But I was categorized by that. So, of course I got around that. They were not happy with me, so they threw me in a cell. They threw me with a guy who said there was mushrooms growing on the wall. And I didn't know how to act to him. But that's what happened.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to, I kind of was hoping that a moment would come in this night where I could do this, and I specifically asked a friend of mine to come join this discussion tonight. It's a Fresno police officer, it's Officer Ron Manning, and he and I have spent a great deal of time together and had many conversations about, racism in law enforcement, and given the opportunity, I wanted to ask him to come and speak on that very issue. And Ron, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your perspective presently as a current police officer.
Well, I need to come up here too.
Testing. Well, first I want to say I am extremely impressed with everything that you guys have had to say. I identified many of the things. You guys are really blessed to have these guys on the panel because the stats in regards to the incarceration rates for the third grade reading levels, all of that is facts. You said there's a book. I'm impressed. First I want to say, I would love to talk about some of the other things you guys were talking about earlier, but in regards to institutional racism, incarceration or prisons, I'm a little nervous to ask you.
You can talk about law enforcement though too, Ron. You can make it, about law enforcement.
I'll try not to expand because I got so much information. But what I'll say to this first is stats. I'm not sure if you guys understand what stats mean for law enforcement, but essentially, society is being cultivated, for statistics where policemen are concerned. And we're conditioned. We're conditioned because there's an expectation for us to go out and arrest a certain number of people because there's a certain level of crime that's being committed in our cities, so we know that there's crime occurring. So there's an expectation for us to go out and catch those guys during certain times of night. Certain activities are occurring on certain days. So there's a statistical category for just about every crime or every behavior, and it's geographically determined. Where these crimes are going to occur, at what time, what the person usually looks like, what he usually wears, so forth and so on. So it's the statistical data that we get driven to go out and enforce that law to capture or arrest that particular person. Now, that's on this level. As far as our government is concerned, in regards to the privatized businesses, I call it a business because there's a register at the end of it when we're talking about privatized prisons. The billions of dollars that they make, there's what they call a ticker, okay, where the Wall Street Stock Exchange has a number that shows the increased amounts based on how much money has been made, and those people who are invested in those prison systems have a personal interest in seeing those monies go up. So how do you get more money? You get more inmates. Okay, so we understand that that's how it works, just like any other commodity. Inmates are considered as a commodity, and if there is a disproportionate number in race, then essentially that is, we're being essentially cultivated so we can make more money for those privatized businesses, okay? And also the government as well. Nonetheless, to police. No one says anything about race. No one says anything like it. If there's any other questions that I would like to address.
No, thanks, Ron. Thank you.
So, all the research says that black and brown folk do not sell or use drugs at any higher rates than white folk in any community across the country. So part of what I think we need to be honest about, right, is the number of violent criminals in our country is not what is causing mass incarceration, right? The overwhelming majority of people in jails and prisons, largely numbers of them have not even had a trial yet. So they're just being held waiting for a trial, right? They're not even guilty. They have not even been deemed guilty yet, but they're still in prison or still in jail because they cannot afford bail or these other kind of pieces. And the second thing is, many folk are in jail because of nonviolent drug offenses. Now, Michelle Alexander says it the best, and I just love to recount this quote. The only thing that black folk in this country have asked for and gotten more of are police and prisons, right? Many of us who live in these communities, we have often thought that the only way to solve these problems is to get more police and tougher policing and tough on crime, et cetera, et cetera. When we ask for more, better education, jobs, then there never seems to be enough money. To the question that was phrased around institutional racism being, how does it influence law enforcement? There is a move across the country in law enforcement agencies from the Attorney General down to the Department of Justice that are actually tackling these questions. And I would encourage all of y'all folk here in Fresno and the Central Valley to push your police chiefs and law enforcement officers to participate in those conversations that are actually tackling issues of unconscious bias, implicit bias, and the role that it serves in law enforcement. It is no longer feasible to point to a system as if it is out of our control. It is our system, and we have the ability to influence and change it by learning more and also by insisting upon the change. So I totally agree with my brother. The system is set up a certain way, but it doesn't have to stay that way. And I think it's upon all of us to make sure that our law enforcement leaders are a part of these emerging conversations that are happening literally across the country with police chiefs, senior law enforcement executives. Folks are wrestling with these questions around race, and we should not expect law enforcement agencies or cities to feel like we have to do that by ourselves. We should join that conversation so we can learn from the best thoughts and practices of people all across the country.
So I'm a strong believer that capitalism and our government are, what drive institutional racism. I think private for-profit prisons really perpetuate institutional racism. When you talk about the war on drugs, the war on terror, the immigration right now, Congress mandated 34,000 beds be filled with immigrants across the country per day. that at least 34,000 beds are filled. When you think of that and you think about what he was saying, how he said it's a supply and demand. As long as there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. They're going to find ways, they're going to find laws, they're going to find new ways to lock us up. And I think it's something we really have to, we have to talk about with our officials. We have to change these policies. We have to change these laws. There's a program called ESCOM here that across the country that has been really devastating to the immigrant community, where basically it turns local law enforcement into federal agents. Now, when you allow for this kind of thing, it pushes racial profiling. Not just here, what happens in Arizona, across the country, you push for, look for people who look brown, who look undocumented. Find people who are black who might have drugs on them for the war on drugs, when it's really not a war on drugs, it's a war on people. So we need to attack, I think, these systems that have been in place that the government tells us are good for us. Of course, the war on drugs, it sounds right. We don't want drugs on our street, but that's not really what it is. And I think we really have to push back and see what these laws are really forcing our communities to do, and our law enforcement to, how they treat us in our communities.
Any last burning comments on this question? All right, please join me in thanking our panel for a robust. So panel members, we are going to move into some small group conversation. You are welcome to, take your seats, or even to go and refresh yourselves, whatever works best. Thank you, personally, thank you so much for what you contributed. So I have a question for all of you. How many of you are here for your very first panel conversation? On race in Fresno, sorry. Okay, how many of you were here for 2 of them? And how many of you have been here for all 3? Fantastic, fantastic. There's no question in my mind that we start from these conversations, from actually sitting with members of our community, having real, honest, vulnerable conversations, and sharing in difficult topics. I want to ask you to give another round of applause, and this is for the good people who do the work at Faith and Community, at PICO organization, and at No Name Fellowship for bringing us together. You guys I think might have something to tell me, but perhaps not. All right, here's what we're going to do. We have about 40 minutes worth of time. What I want you to do is I know these seats don't turn, my apologies for that, but to find 4 or 5 or even 6 people around you. Many of you have now been to 3 different panels. We started with moral questions with our pastors. We moved on to the complexities of identity and dismantling oppression with our community organizers, and now we've had this very focused conversation on issues of mass incarceration, particularly in our area. Bless you. The question is, where do we go from here? This is our 3rd conversation. You're going to hear about some opportunities when we're done with our small group discussion. But what I'm hoping is that we can give a gift to the organizers who have brought us together. So the question for the next, call it half an hour or so, is what would you like to do next? What are you fired up enough about? And it doesn't just have to be on our prison systems, but over this broad topic of conversation about race in Fresno. Where is your energy? Where are you feeling called? What particular gifts do you bring to these issues? So I want you to turn to 4 or 5 of your neighbors, appoint a record keeper. You have a piece of paper in your folder. Even if all you do is write down the main things you'd be excited to get involved with, this is what that means. Say you got an email from No Name Fellowship or from Faith and Community that said, we are meeting to discuss X, or there's going to be a march about Y, or we'd like to organize on Z. You would say, yes, I'll give my time to that. That's what we're asking you. What do you feel passionate about? What do you feel called to? How are you wanting us to step up as a community? The power in grassroots organizing is the people. So, talk to each other, have a record keeper. I'm going to ask that we actually share with one another when we're done some highlights from these conversations, but please write the main points down so that we can collect them and give them to our organizers. Does that make sense? Any questions? Bless you for doing this work. I will give you a warning when you have about 10 minutes left in your conversation. Can we have the microphones on the floor?
Hold the bottom of it. Turn it on.
Maybe till the light turns green? Try? No. There you go. Thank you.
So we were preparing questions.
Can you talk directly into the top of your microphone?
Is it on? So a couple of the things we were addressing. So one of the points was the whole system of the prison system must be dismantled because it inherently is unequal. Then we got into a discussion about the legalization of drugs and what that might do for inequality. We discussed how when prohibition ended, the murder rates went up. And so we're talking about how if we legalize drugs, yes, the price will go down, but it will increase crime rates. So we're going back and forth about whether drugs should be legalized or not. The next thing we discussed was, well, why don't we address a deeper issue of the educational system? So how do we address drugs by first addressing the educational system and addressing the people who educate our kids? So that was also discussed. We talked about educating our educators and how more time is spent, more money is spent on the prison system than our educational system. So we thought that needed to be addressed as well. Then we got into voting and how voting needs to happen. It's absolutely essential. People need to be educated on different candidates that we vote for. But then we started actually addressing that issue as well. Even if we are voting, what if we feel that we don't trust our candidates? What if we feel that the candidates that are being presented to us are actually not representing us? What if they're representing corporate interests rather than our communities, rather than us as individuals? So we started talking about that. We also talked about how many voters only vote for the general election and not the primary election. They're voting for the presidents and not the primary election that needs to change. And the final thing we discussed, we kind of boiled it down, is we felt that what crime is being addressed in our society, we felt that the crime that's being addressed is street crime. And then we started questioning, well, what about white collar crime? What about corporate crime? We discussed how Kelly represented a woman who she was arrested for stealing 75-cent Coca-Cola. She was an African-American female. And she was facing 3 years in jail, whereas we're talking about how bankers, they much higher impact on our society, and yet they are actually being paid for that stuff. They're getting higher bonuses. So we went back to how, who is criminal in our society? Who is criminalized? What does a criminal look like? And does this need to change?
Thank you. Can I ask you to give your sheet to Bryson, who is right in front of you? And here's what I'm going to ask. So it gets harder for each person who gets up. I want you to tell us the things that we have not heard yet. So what did your group discuss that was not already shared? Does that make sense? It's okay if we get some repeats. It is okay if we get some repeats in. I don't think your mic is on. Thank you for your help.
I can speak very loud. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Good. And I don't scream. Okay. So we discussed that first of all we need to move into real action. Not only like have conversations, but before we move into action, we need to have
real intentional conversations in small groups, just as we did right now. And we need to define, before to solve the problem, we need to define the problem. What racism means, what race means, what power means. And then we need to talk about theology and really be intentional of how our faith is going to help us to follow the right path. And once we do that, we need to come together as people of faith and talk about voting. Voting and how can we dismantle the system that is focused on punishment instead of rehabilitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have your list?
We discussed the justice system in terms of the judiciary and what it means. We discussed the judicial system and specifically the judiciary and terms of public defenders and what it means to actually have a defense in the justice system. And we discussed whether or not simply having a person come and speak to you with a little folder for 5 minutes would be a defense. And how unjust and unfair that is in our system where there's 70 defendants in a day and only one person is expected to speak on their behalf. We talked about manifest destiny and the idea, the corruption and inception of the way that our country was founded and what that means moving forward in our contemporary society and the problems that we face in doing that and how we can tell that new story and engage these questions with truth, with honesty, and not be afraid to discuss these things amongst ourselves because many of us do fear to engage these kinds of conversations and we do need to tell these new stories. We do need to not be afraid to just ask the hard questions and to face them. So that's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
The main topic of our group was about community organizing and educating community members about issues. And some of the people in our group were instrumental in getting the public behind option A in the general plan update. There was a small group of 20 or so individuals who were funded by a foundation to be trained in community organizing about issues regarding urban planning. And when they came back to Fresno, they then engaged in the community, teaching people about the issue, getting them excited about it, so that in the end, 300 people were able to come to City Hall and lobby the City Council to approve what was right for Fresno, which was to stop the sprawl and engage in more infill development, which would be better for the city. It's important for community safety because the police, in responding to safety issues, often have to travel a long ways, and people complain about the time it takes for the police to get to someplace. Well, the more sprawl it is, the longer it's going to take for the police to get to these locations. So, to keep the city compact, it will be a safer city as well, and there will be more people there to watch the streets. My contribution was that I'm concerned about the political climate of Fresno is all about safety and law and order and getting more money to the prosecutors, more money to the sheriff's office, more money to the police, more police. And I think this is the wrong approach. We've been talking here about how the public defender's office is underfunded and how we need to have more rehabilitation and less prisons. And how do we engage the public? How do we educate the public that these are the important issues? And the lesson that Fresno has from what these organizers did with the general plan update and educating the community, I think we need to do the same thing with regard to educating the public about this vicious cycle of not dealing with the problem at the right level, which is with young people, teaching them, giving them opportunities so they don't end up in the pathway, the pipeline, as you will mentioned, in prison, but we kind of spend money in the right way rather than for prisons, more for education, rehabilitation, and giving our young people opportunities, and giving people who come out of prison opportunities as well, so they don't go back to prison.
Thank you.
All right, my name is Isaiah Wilson. I go to Sunnyside. I haven't seen it. What our group talks about was media portrayal of how like they portray most racial groups in the media, and how like they keep like portray them as really kind of bad people.
Thank you. Can we have you? Isaiah, got on quicker?
All right, now I can come up here and I can talk to you about the problem and the ideologies that were discussed within our group, but I think this opportunity can be a little bit more than that. I'm going to talk to you about plans of action, courses that you should keep in mind in the future and that you should attempt to carry out. One of the things that I need to kind of get up there is that the phrase institutionalized racism is one that isn't used often enough, and people need to acknowledge that it exists. It exists because we as a society create social constructs of racism, of stereotypes, of prejudice that continue. They are taught to us in our crib, and they will continue to exist long after we die. And these same stereotypes and prejudices that are carried around by community members are carried into systems like the educational system and the police and judicial system. And I think that acknowledging that it exists, not only within ourselves, but within those systems, goes a long way. Having police officers actually admit the fact that, yes, when I'm looking on the street, I'm looking to keep it safe, I will target people of color. I will look at them as criminals because in my mindset, that's who I imagine criminals to be. And I think continued education in that regard will be very important into kind of dismantling the system of oppression and prejudice that we have built up. We have built it up. One other thing we discussed was faith. We were discussing what the faith community can kind of do to kind of help address this issue. And I think that being that link, that pathway between community members and churchgoers, and kind of those people who are affected, the disproportionality that occurs, the prejudice, and the kind of the community work that happens, then being that bridge and doing that relationship building with those communities that are targeted and affected will kind of help them realize that there's a problem going on. I am being educated in my church, not only in theology, but in community and what is happening to myself, my peers. I can connect and communicate with somebody of a different skin color, and I realize that they are not the criminal that I have been taught to believe that they are. And I think churches and community groups doing that will kind of go a long way. I think one of the things that we discussed that we think should happen is that kind of having this discussion with people who are more representative of those people that we're talking about. I came in here and, I thought, okay, we're going to be talking about race. We're going to be talking about, the justice system, prison system. And I look around and the people who are filling up the chairs were, they were white. And I'm kind of thinking, well, we're not talking to the people who are being affected, who are kind of representative of those populations. And if you look at our panel, we saw people who were educated, elected officials, and I think having a panel perhaps of young people who are kind of affected by these issues, talking to their peers, as well as the people who are already here, would go a long way in kind of spreading out that message. So having young people who are the ones who are facing these issues, who are targeted, who have faced police, injustice, I think their words can serve a lot for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Are there any last record keepers who want to speak? It's fine if you don't want to speak. If you have notes from your group that would be of value to our organizers, please do get them to Bryson here at the front. Thank you so much for your time, your passion, and your energy this evening. One more person? Did you want to say something? Please? That's okay. Bryson, another one in the front. I need you to talk into the top of the mic, please. Thank you.
What was just said, I applaud you for those statements. We're just talking about right now, we live in a society where there's just not a lot of compassion in terms of our fellow brothers and sisters. And some of the things that came up, like there's an after-school program where the kids, this is their last resort in terms of being somewhere where they're safe and they can be a part of something to the point where if they're not disciplined or not following the rules, they get kicked out and then have nowhere to go. And some of those things we need to look at because after-school programs are designed to give kids a place to go to feel safe and to present a different environment from the school environment so they have a chance at success. And I read this one book that was talking about education. It's like, why would you want to play a game where there's a win-lose situation and you're talking about the education of the youth that are going to funnel into the future societies that are going to take care of, I guess, us in our old age or however you want to look at it. And it just doesn't make any sense. So a couple of things that I like that I brought up were how we educate ourselves and how even the fact that race doesn't exist, there's just one race and it's human, but yet we think that there might be a Mexican race or there might be Asian race and things that kind of don't make sense in something that goes around that we don't even think about, but it's ingrained in us, but to the point where we have to begin to make conscious choices. So when something dialogue is going in our head about a particular group of people or what we think they should be, like Miguel was saying, we really ponder those things and we say, well, how does that affect me? But then you make a conscious choice about it. So when I see a group of black guys running by, I'm not looking to see who's chasing them. I'm just assuming they're running for exercise or whatever the case may be. But it's not because they're black that I'm making this thing that they must have did something wrong, because somehow that's been ingrained in me probably before I was even aware of it. Another thing were drugs, because we tend to criminalize a user, and we don't know what circumstances took them to that place, as far as if they're suffering from alcoholism or other drugs. But then the reality is prescription drugs are probably one of the biggest industries in America right now. And the funny thing about that is to keep us sane so we can do the things that we think are normal to function, like getting up every day, going to the job that you really don't like, or producing and buying things you really don't need, and wasting the resources that this planet has. So we have all these things that are going on that are affecting who we are as human beings, but the reality is that we can't see our fellow man as a brother or sister. Everything and anything that we back to that is of no use.
Thank you. All right, I'm about to turn the podium back to Bryson, but I want to really thank you all for staying the course with us, not just this evening, but over 3 panel conversations. I think we have heard amazing seeds for next steps together, for conversations and for actions in our community. Bless you for engaging in this work.
I see folks picking up their purses, so before you leave, if you can we can give Reverend Sofia a round of applause. Amazing job. And for our panelists who are still here, could you stand on your feet, please? And let's give them a round of applause as well. Our brother Reza's in the back, give him a round of applause. Awesome. So in your packets, if you can go inside and you see a flyer where you see some folks on the front walking, if you can have a pencil in your packet as well. What this flyer is for is next Saturday, May 31st at 10 a.m., Faith and Community is having a prophetic vision event at Fresno High School's auditorium, where 1,500 people are going to be packing the auditorium, casting vision around what a new Fresno looks like. What does it mean for us to have a just and equitable Fresno? Yeah, give that a round of applause. What does it mean to have a just and equitable Fresno, and how can we come together across all ethnicities? I intentionally didn't say races. All ethnicities, across all class, to come together to cast vision, to move together in power and in unison. Somebody say amen? All right. And so here you have your commitment cards on the bottom. You can tear this off. First, we would like for you to sign or to put that you have checked the box saying that you will attend on May 31st. And you can tear that off and you can hand it to some folks we'll have walking down the aisle to collect these commitment cards from you. But we really would love for you to be in attendance. Your attendance is extremely important because we're going to have space to cast vision together. And Pastor Phil has something else to say about this particular commitment card.
So, many of you have expressed over the last 3 conversations about race that you've wanted to go deeper. You've wanted to further the conversation. So here's what you're going to do if that is you. If it hasn't been satisfactory for you simply to come and listen to panelists and engage in the small group dialogue that we've made available in the 3-hour windows that we've created, at the very bottom of this very same flyer, the very bottom, there's a line. It's completely blank. There, you should just write something about, I want to continue to talk about race in Fresno. Anything like that you write at the bottom, we will consider your expression of wanting to continue the conversation. Here's what's going to happen with that. If you do that, Dr. Karen Crozier at Fresno Pacific University, she has agreed to host a series of small group dialogues over the next 12 months. And if you write at the very bottom of this flyer that you want to be part of that, then you are going to be invited. We already have your name, we have your phone number, we have your email address. You'll be invited to become part of those conversations over the next 12 months. And so that is an invitation to you. You will also receive that invitation via email the next couple of days from Faith and Community and from No Name Fellowship on our Facebook pages, both. But if you're here tonight, since you're still here, why don't you save yourself some time and just write it on the very bottom here on this blank line. People are going to come around, they're going to collect these in just a few moments. As we close out the evening, again, it's been such a privilege for No Name Fellowship and Faith and Community to partner together in these last 3 conversations. And tonight, we are so deeply grateful to Carla Kirk in the back, who is the lead professor African American Studies here at Fresno City College, and she and Fresno City College joined this conversation tonight, this partnership, to really further it and deepen it, and made this space available to us tonight. We're so grateful for her and for Fresno City College this evening. Again, it has been a great privilege for the last 6 months or so for No Name and for Faith and Community to partner together to host these conversations. We have viewed it as a success to simply create the space to have the conversation. But we know that many of you want to go deeper, and that's what the invitation for May 31st is about, and that's the invitation to be part of the conversations, the ongoing conversations that Dr. Crozier are about into the future. Bryson, anything else?
Go in peace.
Peace to you all. God bless you. Have a wonderful night. Thank you for being here tonight.